Hello again, and welcome to the second part of this interlude, in which we will use almost everything we have learned so far to model a bolt pistol. We are going to do this in a primitive way, that is to say by assembling several simple geometric shapes, and since a bolt pistol is very geometric, it should be easy. I start by deleting all our previous objects with the A key to select all and the X key to delete selection. Then let's see how a bolt gun looks like. So I grabbed this little image from the internet, but what would be great is to have this image inside the software. And of course Blender allows us to do that. We can create a new type of object that is a reference image, and that will allow us to have the bolt pistol blueprint in the viewport permanently. So images objects are aligned to the view by default. So we will first set a front view aligned on the Y global axis, a view parallel to the XZ plane. And we will do as we did before to create an object. Shift+A key to open the Add menu. And this time rather than choosing a mesh type object, we will choose Images, then Reference. It opens a file explorer where I can find the picture file. And here I have my reference image in the 3D viewport. Then we're going to make some small adjustments. For that, let's go to the Object Data Properties tab in the Properties editor. So just here. And as you can see, as we said before in the video about Properties Editor, the pictogram of this tab has changed again, because it is a different type of data. So here you can adjust the size of the image. But here we are not going to model at scale, so I leave it like that. Then we can adjust what is called depth. To explain that, I will create a small object that I will voluntarily put behind our image. So if I go back to the Object Data Properties, we can see depth is set on default mode. So by default the image behaves like a regular object. So it hides the objects behind it, and it is hidden if it is behind other objects. If we want to have all other objects permanently in front of the image, we can choose back mode in depth options. And like that, other objects are always displayed in front of my reference image. Then we can choose on which side of the object the image is displayed. Here we are using both mode, so the image is displayed on each side of the object. But I can tell Blender to display the image only on the front. You can also choose to not display the image whether you are using orthographic projection or perspective. And it's true that in perspective projection, it's not necessarily useful to display the reference image. We will never be well aligned on the image because of perspective deformation. It's going to bother us more than anything else. So I'm going to uncheck perspective. And so now, if I switch between each projection mode, my image disappears when I'm in perspective and reappears when I'm in orthographic projection. We also have this option which asks us if we want to display the image only when the view is axis aligned. And indeed, if we are in any view like here, the image is not very useful either. So I will activate this option and suddenly the image disappears. And if I align the view back along y-axis, so remember, to do that we hold Alt key down to snap to an axis while orienting the view, and once the view is aligned, the image will reappear. Like that we can work on our gun by being well aligned with the image. And of course if I leave the alignment, the image disappears because we don't need it anymore. We're also going to adjust image opacity. To make it a little less visible, we're going to put it around 40%. That doesn't seem bad. Last thing interesting to do is to freeze the image, so I could not select it accidentally. So let's go to the outliner. We activate the selectable option in the filter menu, and I uncheck selectable for the reference image. Another thing I like to do is to always have the image displayed somewhere, in a corner of my screen for example, so I can always take a quick look at it when the reference image is not displayed. If you have an extra screen, you could display the reference image on that screen, but otherwise you can use the image editor. As we saw in the video about the user interface, we can add an area and display any editor inside. So let's create one here and put it at the bottom of our UI. And we can choose to display image editor in this area using this menu. Then using this button, we can find our picture in a file browser. And that's it. Now we can take a look at our reference image anytime on the lower right side of our interface. Here, our setup is finally in place, so we can start. We will start by analyzing the gun, by identifying the different elements that compose it. To simplify modeling, a good method is to break down the object into parts that are close to a simple geometric shape. With a gun or everything that is mechanical, it is very simple because it is precisely an assembly of different simple manufactured objects. We have this element that seems to be a single object. Then we have the element at the back which is slightly less thick. Here we have the handle, the magazine, we have the fore end, we also have barrels, and finally we have this part, let's say the viewfinder, and the whole top part. We will start with the main part. Which primitive form comes closest to this element? I would say a cube, because it's a good base for anything parallelepiped. Then we will use Scale tool to deform the cube and make it match the drawing. But as you can see, the shape we want to model can't be done with a simple cube because of this concave corner. Well, we don't yet know how to do polygonal modeling, so we will break this object down into two objects, one for the right part and a smaller one for the left part. Here we go! First, I create the cube using Shift-A, Mesh, and here is our cube. I will move it, let's say roughly here, and I'm going to scale it right away to make it smaller. For this tutorial, I wanted to start by using gizmos, so you can clearly see what I'm doing. But as you can see, scaling with a gizmo is not very practical. It's fine if you only have to do it from time to time. But here we are going to use the Scale tool a lot. So I will go back to the Move tool. We will use the Move gizmo when we move an object, but for scaling, we will use shortcuts. So remember, we can do a uniform scale with the S key. So first, I'm just going to scale the cube in order to make its height match the draw. Then I center the object, and then scale it only along the x-axis to increase the width. So I use the S then X keys to trigger scale transformation along x-axis and make the width matching. Then I will adjust the thickness in a perspective view. It seems a little too thick to me, so I'm going to scale it along y-axis with SY keys like that. Let's go back to a front view and tackle the second part. So rather than creating a new cube and set height and thickness again, I'm going to start from the first object. So I duplicate it with Shift+D, and I'm going to move it along x-axis roughly here. We adjust the width with a scale along x-axis, and it doesn't look too bad like that. Then we scale it along z-axis to make the height matching. We can get closer to be more precise. And that's good like that. So as you can see, we have a flickering phenomenon. This is because this face and this face are exactly on the same plane, since we have duplicated them. And because those faces are overlapping, Blender does not know which faces it should display, the one of this object or the one of that object. Therefore, it displays the two alternately, and it gives this flicker. So what we can do, because it's still very disturbing, is to slightly scale one of these two objects along y-axis, so the faces are no longer perfectly coplanar. In this way, we eliminate the flickering phenomenon. I go back to my front view, and now we're going to tackle the fore end. So as before, we're going to start from this object there, because we want to create a very similar object. So we duplicate it with Shift+D, and we're going to put it roughly in the center of this part. We scale it along x-axis with SX key to set the width. On the drawing we can see the fore end is the thickest part of the gun, so we can scale it a little along y-axis. So here, we have made one part of our fore end, and to complete it, we can see that we have to duplicate it several times. So what I'm going to do is duplicate and move the object in a single operation, and then I'm going to be able to repeat this operation with a function called repeat last. So I duplicate the object with Shift plus D, and I move it along x-axis using X key, then move it with my mouse, and validate the operation with a left click. So I did two actions in a single operation. I duplicated it and moved it, because as long as I haven't validated anything with the left mouse button, I'm still in the same operation. The whole operation can be repeated with Repeat Last tool, using Shift and R key. That is the trick. So let's do it once, twice, and 3 times. So there it does not work very well, because distance between the first and the second element was not good. So I'd better undo everything with Ctrl Z and scale the element along x-axis to make it a bit shorter. And let's do what we did again. Shift plus D, move along x-axis, and this time let's try to set a more realistic space between these two parts, and confirm our operation with a left click. Then I repeat this operation with Shift plus R. Damn! It's not that yet. So then I will select everything and scale the whole selection along x-axis. It can be a good method as well. So let's say it's good enough like that. We are not perfectly aligned with the drawing, but well, our objective is not to be 100% identical. Then we're going to do the upper part. As usual, I'm going to duplicate one of our objects with Shift plus D, move it roughly there, and then rotate it 90 degrees. So since the view is aligned on the correct axis, i.e. the y-axis, to do our rotation I just have to hit R and then enter 90 with the keyboard to trigger a 90-degree rotation. We're going to enlarge this object a little bit in height like that. And it has to be wider, roughly like that. I'm even going to make it a little thicker to avoid the flickering phenomenon. And that's it. To finish the fore end, we can see that there is a part below there. I don't know what it corresponds to, but we are going to model it because it will fill in a hole we don't want. So I duplicate this object here, then move it along the axis about here. And then with SX I change the width, and I'm going to move it here. We're going to make it less thick with SY. And that's it. It's maybe a little too high, it will collapse with the barrel. So let's do a SC to change height. And I'll lower that. And I'll lower that too. Or make it a little taller along the axis. And that's it. Now we won't have too much empty space inside the fore end. Now we are going to tackle this whole part. This part should obviously be made with another technique rather than assembling cubes. A technique that allows us to extrude and move vertices to draw polygons that follows exactly the profile of our object. But since we don't know how to do that yet, we'll manage to do it with cubes anyway, and we'll get there. So let's start from this object, which I think is very close to what we want. Let's duplicate it. And yeah, it is almost fine like that. I place it here, and as you can see on the drawing, the element we are working on is less thick than the first element, so let's scale it down along y-axis. And now we're missing that whole part. This polygonal shape can be decomposed into several rectangular parallelepipeds. So we can reduce height and increase width. And that's it. We duplicate this object again, and we move it along the axis. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing here. When we duplicate an object, we can move it directly without having to get the Move tool, and if I press the middle mouse button, transformation is constrained on an axis. This axis is the one closest to the mouse cursor, and since I move my cursor up, the axis is automatically selected, so it's very convenient to use Shift+D, move your cursor a bit toward the axis you want to follow, and then use the middle mouse button. This way you can move directly the duplicated object along a specific axis very quickly. And then to do the bevel, since we don't yet know how to create oblique objects, well, we're going to duplicate this one, move it along the axis, and with a scale along x-axis, we will make sure that these two edges have the same length. So let's make it a little bigger like that, and there we can rotate the object by -45 degrees. So since the view is aligned on the axis we want to rotate on, I just need to press R and hit -45 degrees on my keyboard. Then I can adjust object's position. I'm going to stop using the gizmo a bit. You will see by just hitting G key that is working as well, and it's less restrictive than using a gizmo. And to fill this hole here, I just duplicate this object, position it, and there you go. We almost finished this part. So with so many coplanar overlapping faces, there's a lot of flicker. So we're going to take this object there, and that object as well, and we're going to make them a little bit thinner. Oops, this one should be thicker, like that, and here you go. So then we have this little thing there. To do it, I'm going to start from this object, I duplicate it, and then I can immediately rotate it with R. I type 90 and I validate. Then I move it roughly to the center and scale it uniformly, then move it. I will scale it again along X to make it a little wider, a little more thicker with a scale along Y-axis. And that's it. Now we are going to make the barrels. So for the barrels, I'm going to explain something to you. Since now, when we created objects, let's create a cylinder to show you. We could have think that Blender always places new objects at the center of the world, since object is created at the crossroads of the three world axes. And well, actually that's not true. In fact, an object is always created where this small target, which you see here, is located. This target is called the 3D cursor. We can position the 3D cursor using this tool, and with a left click I move my 3D cursor. You can also do this using any tool by holding Shift key and right click. So now if I create a new cylinder, we can see that the cylinder is created where the 3D cursor is located. So I will delete this cylinder, and now I'm going to set a left view, a view that will help us to align the barrel correctly. I put my 3D cursor a bit near the center of my future cylinder, and then I create my cylinder with Shift-A, Mesh, Cylinder, and I align it on the view. I adjust the radius roughly like that. We could also adjust the height, and there I realize that the object was not perfectly placed. But it's not too bad. The goal in using the 3D cursor is to reduce the number of operations by placing a new object roughly directly where you want. For the second barrel, nothing could be simpler. I duplicate this object. A little middle mouse click to move it along the axis. I will make it smaller with a uniform scale, and that's it. Then let's create the viewfinder and everything that is here. So I'm going to start from this object which roughly corresponds to what I want to do. I duplicate it, and I'm going to put it here. It's a bit too thick, so I will fix that with a scale along Y-axis. Then I'm going to duplicate that object, and I'm going to put it here. It's way too thick, so we'll do a little scale along Y-axis, and for that whole part, I will make this part a bit beefier first, and then with a Shift+D I duplicate the object, rotate it with R key, type 90 for a 90 degrees rotation, and I'm going to put it pretty much here. We're going to increase the height with an SE and a little SY to avoid flickering, and it's not too bad. Then we have this part, so there we will simply duplicate this object. What we want is the whole aspect looks convincing. we are not making a carbon copy. Let's go back to a front view, and from this point of view, I feel like something is missing here. There is a kind of hollow which is going to bother us once we want to print our gun, so I'm going to duplicate this object, and we're just going to place it here. And then we're going to do as usual to avoid flickering. Now it will remain for us to model the handle. I'm going to start from this object, which I put here. It doesn't need to be that wide, so we're going to scale it like that. G key to move. I increase the size a little bit, and that's it. Then we can see on the image that the entire handle is even thinner than the rest of the bolter. So we set a 3/4 view, and with SY we adjust the thickness. Now I duplicate this object there and place it about there. Then we hit our key for a rotation along Y-axis. Since our view is well aligned to Y-axis we want to rotate on. But there to adjust the scale along X and Z axis we are a little annoyed, because since we have made a rotation, our object is no longer aligned with global axis. We will soon see how to use object's axis orientation, but for now, we are going to cancel the rotation. With another rotation, I am going to get back to where we were before. Then we can scale the object along X-axis, and there I redo my rotation, G key to move, and that's it. And to be a little bit closer to the drawing, we're just going to do this part. So there I'm going to start from the handle, so Shift plus D, and our key to make a rotation, like that. But actually it would have to be a little narrower. So I cancel with Ctrl Z, then I do a Shift plus D, and our key again, and this time I'm going to try to align the object straight. And there I can scale it along global X-axis, another small scale along Z-axis, and now I can redo my rotation and position my object. And we will say that it is good like that. Then let's create the magazine. We will start from this object there, so Shift plus D, then SX to make it a little less wide, SE to make it a little higher, and we do a rotation, a small uniform scale, and we're obviously going to do it less thick than this part there. Then a little rotation again. And then for this part we're going to do that quickly by duplicating this object, and as we did earlier, we put it back straight with a rotation, then SE for the height, SX for the width, SE one more, then a little rotation, and then we try to align it as well as possible. I don't know if you see how I can switch between transformations tools so easily. I can rotate with the simple or short key, hop we make the rotation, we move a little with G key, we redo a rotation, another rotation to align objects, a little move to adjust position, etc. It's really very pleasant to finally adjust things so quickly. And there you go. We missed this little element here, so for that, what we're going to do is switch to a display mode called wireframe. So this will only display the edges of our objects and hide the faces, which means our object will become kind of transparent. Then we're going to create a new object. So I move my 3D cursor here. I create a new cube that I'm going to scale more or less correctly like that. It's too wide, so let's do a SX to adjust it, then go back to regular display mode. I'm going to center my object a bit, like that. After having made a small scale along Y-axis, our object is now visible from both sides, like that, and we put it a bit lower. And finally, we're going to do those little things here. So as earlier we go into wireframe view, we place our 3D cursor here, then Shift A, Mesh, Cylinder, align with the view with a slightly smaller diameter. We can go back to regular view, and we center the object. I just duplicate it to create the second thing. So Shift plus D, and we'll put it pretty much there. Then, we are going to scale it a little along Y-axis, so we can see it on both sides like that. There, we almost finished our gun. I believe I have already mentioned Boolean in a previous video. So let's spice up this tutorial by modeling the barrel's hole with a Boolean modifier. So if you remember, I already told you about Boolean modifier in the tutorial about the properties editor. So let's do it again for this barrel. So first I'm going to duplicate this object, and this object will be used to dig the hole. The hole is facing the other way, so I rotate it along the axis. So our key, Z key. Then I type 90 to rotate the object 90 degrees. Then I just have to make it a little bit smaller. Let's go back to wireframe so we could see exactly where the hole is. And then with a little uniform scale, I set the object approximately close to the hole diameter. And finally, I scale it along y-axis so it will go over both sides of the barrel. Okay, so we have our two operators, operator A, which is the barrel, and operator B, which is the object we just duplicate, and which will be used to dig the hole into the barrel. So I select my first operator, and then I must look for my properties editor, which had disappeared. Here it is. Then I move to Modifiers tab, and I apply a Boolean modifier. So now we need to target our second operator with the eyedropper, so this object here, and our barrel is now holed. So let's hide the second operator. Remember, there is a magic shortcut to hide an object, which is H key. And here is our barrel hold. Well, this bolt pistol start to be not that bad. We could go on, but hey, you understood the principle. And well, if we take a little step back, frankly, even for a primitive modeling, it's quite convincing. If we imagine this model printed at the scale of a miniature, I think it would be quite well. So we will export the project as a STL files to see how it looks like in Lychee Slicer. To do that, I select all the objects I want to export, and I go to File, Export STL, then I will name my file. Be careful to export only the selection by checking this box here. Then in Lychee I will load our bolter. First thing to note, if we look at the print layers, well, we realize that our model is totally printable. All the layers are solid, there are no hollows or holes. So obviously there might be something missing here to connect the front part and the rear part of the bolter to avoid a too big overhang. But now you know how to do that by creating or duplicating an object. In Lychee Slicer there is a mode that I love. When you go to export, by default you are in object mode, but you can switch to at scale mode. This will display the object in an everyday object context, here with a banana and a soda can. So here, we can see the object is a little too small compared to reality, so I'm going to scale it a little, and even after that, we could say that finally if you print this object at the scale of a miniature, it is quite convincing enough. So here it is. I wanted to show you that you can start doing things by your own with the little knowledge we learned so far in this tutorial series. The aim is also to encourage you to spend time on Blender. The more time you spend on it, by manipulating objects or orienting the view, the more this gymnastics will become instinctive. Orienting the view will become as natural to you as turning your head in the real world, just as transforming an object will be done mechanically without even thinking that you are doing it. That's how you can be creative with Blender, because you will no longer think anymore about technique, but you will just have to think about what you want to create. I met a lot of people who already do this kind of modelization with Mesh Mixer. I wanted to show you that it is not more complicated to do the same thing with Blender. Except that the time you spend on Blender instead of Mesh Mixer, you will learn a software much more powerful. So my aim is to encourage you to switch to this software to create your own projects. Here I must say something. If there are confirmed 3D amateurs or professionals, if you are watching this video, obviously what I showed in this video, creating objects by assembling intersecting cube rather than using polygon editing, yes, it is for sure a total heresy. I say it, I know it, it's not the correct way to model, but in fact we don't care. The idea here is manage to do what we want to do, quick and dirty, even if we don't know yet all software's functionality to do it properly. On the other hand, this time I am speaking to novice, there are things we have done that are correct here, like breaking down the bolt pistol into different objects. What we did to model the barrel is correct. What we did for this part is good, and these things as well. For this part, it would have to be a single object, this one too, instead of multiple cubes overlapping each other's. But hey, we'll learn how to do that later. The magazine could also have been done like we did, with two objects. In short, we still learned a good approach to model an object properly. We will go further with more professional methods in other tutorials, but in the meantime, if you have simple modeling ideas, which can be easily broken down into geometric shapes as we have just done, well, you will be able to use Blender to achieve this idea right now. And here we can move on to the second chapter. In the next videos, we will still learn other tools and concepts, which are quite important before starting to pose a miniature. Thank you for having followed this video, and I'll see you very soon.